I rather stupidly actually titled my talk today Exposing the Truth About Equal Opportunity in Public Education. We've already heard some reasons why public education and education generally may be considered to be in dire straits. So I'm not going to repeat some of Richard's analysis, with which I largely agree. You might also now have concluded that there are very good reasons why I'm no longer involved in politics. We've heard discussion about the decline of the Labor Party and its values, the treatment of asylum seekers. There are a whole range of issues on which I have to indicate my dissent, I suppose, from the existing public discussion. What I want to talk about today, however, is something that's several steps back from that. Not in a sense to deny my involvement in some of those discussions and debates while in politics, but to ask a few of the questions I think that have been raised this morning and this afternoon about what we value, how we can ascertain what people want if we're in government, how we can redirect some of those needs and interests if it's a greater good that's being served by redirecting those needs and interests. I started talking about inequality, certainly not alone in this, but about 15 years ago. And most of the discussion at that time was about inequality that took the form of a failure to have equality before the law, or equality of political power, or access to various of society's goods and services, of discrimination of various kinds against minorities and indeed majorities. My first interests in inequality, a great deal earlier than that, were in relation to the position of women and the position of Indigenous people. All of those, I think, remain significant problems. But in many ways, although we have at least tried in various ways to reduce those inequalities and discriminations, it's still pretty clear that ours, despite our rhetoric, is a society where a lot of inequality is tolerated. And I would argue that to the extent that that's true, it's inherently destructive, and that a civilised objective and a proper role for government is the reduction of inequity wherever it occurs. Now, obviously, as I said, that has many faces. But it's all based on the assumption, the drive for equality, that is, that we're all equally worthy. I guess I drew my inspiration initially from the teachings of the Christian Church, but it could have been any religion, and then subsequently from the socialists who are behind the establishment of the United Nations and its charter. Taken seriously, obviously, that view should translate into actions which cherish human lives, no matter where they are or how they're lived. However, I think it's important, and this is what I've been, I guess, thinking about over the last little while, to consider that the case for equality is not simply a moral one, for perhaps pragmatic reasons. This is most dramatically illustrated in some of the interpretations we've seen recently of why we are in the parlous state we are economically in the developed world, to a lesser extent in the developing world. As Paul Krugman has argued, it's no accident that both major 20th century economic crises, the first in 1929 and the second in 2008, coincided with historic levels of inequality. And whereas when I first started to talk about economic inequality 15 years ago, people were inclined to dismiss it and say, look, the critical thing is that the poor are getting less poor, even if the rich are getting richer. But I would argue that it's actually extremely difficult to achieve any of these other forms of equality in the absence of reasonable levels of equality in income and wealth. And in fact, that conspicuous income inequality may have seriously distorting effects on community well-being and the community willingness, indeed, to engage in a whole lot of desirable behaviours, many of which have been discussed here today. And that appears to be true no matter what the average level of wealth or economic development, whether it's China or India or Australia or the United States. And as you know, I'm sure, in an audience like this, there's considerable evidence that societies which have the greatest differentials in wealth and income are also likely to be the ones with the most inequality in access to other resources, including power and influence. Now, that varies between the developed and emerging economies, but nonetheless, I think it's generally true. And I think it's important to note that they are, in a lot of these global comparisons, also the most likely to discriminate against minorities and to limit universal access to public goods such as education and health services. And I think many of the inequalities we're seeing emerge now are going side by side with those growing inequalities in wealth and income, inequalities which the average citizen perceives, even if they underestimate it. And there's some very interesting data on that. I think it's fair to say now that whatever its precise causes, and it probably differs from place to place, income inequality, wealth inequality is almost universally on the rise. And even during this financial crisis, it's continued to rise. And recent evidence from the OECD, for instance, confirms that there's been a significant and widespread increase in income inequality during the last 20 years in the developed world. From the 80s onward in particular, and it's no accident, as we've heard from David McKnight. And the biggest gaps have emerged, in fact, in those countries that swallowed the neoliberal Bible completely, the UK and the US. In the latter case, incomes for the majority of Americans remained stagnant, while the wealth at the very top has increased exponentially. And while I wouldn't want to say it's quite the same problem here as in the United States, nonetheless we're heading in the same direction. And researchers generally agree that inequality amongst Australians is also increasing. Indeed, reports for the last 12 months show that it's continued to rise, whether you talk about wealth where it's greater or income where it's perhaps less dramatic. Now, for a people who were part of the wage earners' welfare state, I think this sits very uneasily with our idea of equality. We do pride ourselves on the idea that this is an egalitarian society. But what we've been systematically doing, as David McKnight has indicated, is neutering a lot of the instruments which were designed to spread our wealth. The sorts of things that we did to make sure that our citizens had both cash and non-cash benefits. It doesn't matter so much whether you've got a high income if the transport system is good, the education system is open, and social mobility is still active. When all those things freeze up, as they've done under the neoliberal experiment, we have a form of stasis which I think affects people's thinking. As you'll know from the international literature, the effects of inequality are largely negative and significant. And they go to things like life expectancy, a whole range of social problems. There are all sorts of indices that indicate, wherever you are in the world, that the greater the inequality, the worse these social outcomes. And that's true whether you take a time slice of every nation at the same time or whether you look at trends over time. The US and the UK are cases in point. In the United States now, there was recent papers showing that amongst white males in the poorer parts of the United States, life expectancy is going backwards. That had already started to happen with African Americans, but it's now also affecting the less well-off in that community. And behind this is the assertion and indeed evidence that it's not just the less well-off in the society who suffer in unequal societies. It's everybody, because the aggregate level goes down and you look at every segment of the society and find that they do less well. And in a sense, that's what we've found in education. As the system has become more segmented on the basis of income, it's not just that we have a longer tail, as has been described, but also that the children of the privileged are doing less well than they previously had done, that the aggregate level of performance is being pulled down. As was indicated by Richard, we don't measure all that we should in education, so there are probably lots of other things going on as well, including a degree of social incomprehension when you have children from different backgrounds educated in different systems. And certainly for the less well-off, who are segregated in poorly resourced schools, the outcomes are clearly worse than they are for the privileged in our system. But that is one of the outcomes in an unequal society. What we find is that levels of trust decline, levels of understanding of one group of people to another decline, racist attitudes appear to increase, volunteering and participation in civic society are reduced, approval of and participation in democracy are reduced, and I think some of the stepping back we're seeing from politics in Australia today is precisely because of that set of attitudes, that we become a more atomised society where people are worrying all the time about their status and position because they can see these widening gaps, and they worry for their children, which is why I think some of them can be enticed into removing them into what they see as better schools, even though it's very clear from the evidence that if you take account of the background of students, public schools do as well as private schools, and you'd be better off taking your children for a trip around the world than paying all those fees into private education. One of the things that occurs with this widening inequality, and again I'm drawing on the global data, is that there's a great deal of unwillingness to spend on public goods. And it actually spreads through the entire society. So that generally speaking, those societies that are more unequal, and it's a chicken and egg question, are also less likely to spend on things like education. There's a form of economic individualism that grows alongside it, and that it's expected that people will look after themselves. Indeed, interestingly, what you find in these societies over time, as they become more unequal, via what's called a relative income effect, is that there are shifts of preferences, even amongst the less well-off, in favour of private goods instead of public ones. And that, as I say, is a pattern that I think we've seen emerge in Australia. And it's fair to say that inequality is actually a proxy for other social indicators. So when we see inequality growing, we can expect all these other things to shift in line with it. And we see the undermining of social goods. I wonder if someone could grab me a glass of water. If that's 5 minutes, is it?
10. Yeah.
10?
Oh, 5 to go.
5 to go, good. I need a mouthful. I could probably give you an explanation of why people's mouths dry up in speeches. It has more to do with nervousness than travel, but it's probably a bit of both. So my take on all of this is that what's happening now, although we are wealthier than we've ever been collectively, these gaps that are opening up in Australia and elsewhere are actually driving social ills rather than some of the remedies that might improve, for instance, our treatment of the environment. Because one of the things that goes along with inequality is, 1, more private consumption. 2, more consumption altogether as people compare themselves. What they're consuming doesn't contribute to their well-being because there's no increase in collective well-being. There's in fact a decrease when you have widening inequality. And people who are materialistic and constantly measuring themselves against others are also less likely to give a damn about the environment. They're more likely to think that the consumption of goods will actually improve their well-being. So even when, as we've heard, they have enough to survive, we have enough to survive, there's also this strong compulsion, which seems to be related, to consume more and more. And as I've suggested, there are potentially detrimental effects to democracy itself. So we have low levels of support for any action by government, we have low levels of support for government, and a greater desire indeed to see governments fail. And I think some of what we're seeing, as a matter of fact, is that people are looking at governments and saying, they can't do what I need to do. My son, who's 40-ish, tells me there are plenty in his generation who say, a bit like the Americans, government should get out of the way. They should let us do what we can do best, and they should not interfere in the distribution of goods and services. They shouldn't interfere in educational choices. They should leave us, in a way, to think for ourselves. And I think that's the other side of this coin. When I first saw it, I understood perfectly what was meant by it. But I'm concerned that in Australia we have lost that sense of the common good, the collective effort, the modern state. And people do underestimate the extent to which we rely on a fully functioning education system, a finance system, a legal system, a health system, which is the result of our collective efforts. And to the extent that we pull it apart and demand that people take care of themselves, not recognising how important equality of treatment, equality of outcome, and a sense of having an equal share in the society are, then we'll continue to see this pulling apart, this fragmentation of a society that has in the past, for all its limitations, actually understood, I think, how important it is that citizens genuinely are equal.